This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletko.
And I'm Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell this week?
Well, what the hell is going on is that there is a major crisis in America of confidence in experts. The American people don't trust experts, and there's a number of reasons for it, but the most recent one is the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, where the public health experts told us repeatedly that we needed to wear masks and we needed to keep our kids out of school and we needed to get they told us that the vaccines would prevent us from getting COVID. And they told us that a whole bunch of things that ended 6-foot distancing, which turned out to be not real and not based on science. And a lot of this stuff was exposed. And a lot of people are very resentful about how their lives were to this day disrupted. I mean, we've had multiple podcasts here about the costs of the pandemic lockdowns in terms of mental health, in terms of educational outcomes and all the rest of it. And I think there's been a major reaction in this country where people just don't trust experts anymore. What do you think, Danny?
So I agree with that, and I think it's a huge problem. And we're talking today to the head of our think tank, Robert Doar, who is the father expert of all of the experts at AEI. I think that the most important thing is to have a recognition of where we went wrong. One of the things that truly grossed me out was how Anthony Fauci just didn't seem to have any repentance whatsoever for the lives that were destroyed during COVID, for the mistakes that were made during COVID, for the millions of people. You know, if you talk about the number of people who were impacted by illness, we're talking about a lot of people, but probably exponentially more who lost their businesses, who lost their livelihoods, who lost their homes, and their children. Mark, you and I have talked about this repeatedly. The children who lost their learning and are really, in some cases, never going to recover. It seems to me that our strength at AEI is a willingness to say, hey, that was a screw up. Yeah, we should have handled that differently. Where we do not see that in the government expert class at all.
Exactly. And then there are other areas of expertise where the experts have been proven wrong, which is, for example, the experts, and you and I were in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the 1990s fighting permanent normal trade relations for China, where our boss Jesse Helms was the leader of that effort. And the experts class in the economic world said, no, that's a great idea. If we bring China into the rules-based international order, as that famous phrase has gone down in ignominy in so many ways, they'll democratize and they'll behave better and all the rest of it. And what the opposite has happened. They've become more authoritarian. They've become wealthier. Our businesses have become essentially foreign agents in many cases for the Chinese Communist Party, pushing back on things like congressional legislation to ban the importation of products made with slave labor. And China has become more powerful. And also we found that we don't even produce many of the things that we, from a national security perspective and a public health perspective, we don't make them here anymore, and we're dependent on them. So there was massive mistake made there. There's a lot of areas where the experts have discredited themselves. And so what we're doing today is we're bringing in our boss, Robert Doar, who is the head of AEI, which is an institution of experts, to talk a little bit about how do experts regain their credibility and how do we as an institution made up of a lot of experts and a lot of really smart people in a lot of different areas navigate this new era in which expertise is almost looked down on by a majority of Americans.
It's really funny. Let's talk about this in the political context for a second. I remember, this is really years ago, when George W. Bush, who people don't think of as terribly controversial anymore in the era of politics, when George W. Bush was elected, and Stephen and I were both still on the Hill, right? And one of Stephen's Democratic counterparts turned to him and said, well, I know why he won. because the American people are stupid. And I feel like that informs a great deal of thinking inside certain areas of the left, but also inside the expert class. That in fact, we believe in democracy, but we believe in democracy because the democracy should be made up of people like us, writers at The Atlantic. And that sort of sneering disdain for normal people who ought to understand instinctively why it is that we need to do A, B, or C. And, one of the things that I resented most, for example, about the Biden administration was, yes, I believe, and I know you do too, that we ought to support Ukraine. But if the president of the United States doesn't give a single damn speech to the American people explaining why this is important to them, why the hell should they think it's important to them? This is respect for voters, respect for people who don't pay attention to the news every 5 minutes like we do, seems to be something that we are losing. And it's no wonder then that they turn around and have disdain because we don't respect them. Why should they respect us?
Well, this is also a problem which is that the expert class, I think you're right, has disdain for a lot of people in the expert class, not all, have disdain for ordinary Americans. And, Bill Buckley famously said, I'd rather be governed by the first 5,000 names in the Boston Telephone Directory than the faculty of Harvard College. And what his point is that the collective wisdom of millions of Americans is better than the wisdom of the educated few at Harvard. That's why America's free enterprise system works and Soviet communism failed, is because a bunch of experts sitting in Moscow coming up with a 5-year plan, however smart they are, isn't going to be as effective as millions of Americans making decisions about their lives. And that's, I think, one of the things that distinguishes conservatism from the left is that we have a respect for the collective wisdom of ordinary Americans. And what we provide people like us who spend time studying issues, we're not smarter than ordinary people. We just spend a lot more time learning about the details. But most of these things are common sense, that most Americans, given the right information about the situation in Ukraine or the situation in Israel and the situation what's happening with Syria, can make pretty smart decisions. And that's why we have this podcast, for example, is, the whole idea of this podcast is people want to know what the hell is going on in Syria. So we bring in a really smart person who knows about Syria and explains it for people who are not experts to understand it so that they can come to decisions. And many of our listeners come to one decision or another or feel differently about things, but they're all smart and they come to, given the right information, come to smart conclusions. And that's how our public policy should be made. Right? That people, our job as scholars and writers and commentators is to inform people and give them our opinions and facts and let them come to their own conclusions. And so I think the problem becomes the difference between the right and the left is the right, our experts try to inform and provide information to people and opinions to people, whereas the left sees the experts as the ruling class who should be making the decisions and informing the electorate of their decisions. Is that fair?
I think it's totally fair. I really do. And I think I was glad to hear Robert really lead with that. So, hey, let's go to our interview. For those who don't know him, he has his own podcast at AEI as well. Robert Doar is the president of the American Enterprise Institute. He's served as the co-chairman of the National Commission on Hunger. He's a lead member of the AEI Brookings Working Group on Poverty and Opportunity. But he first joined us in 2014 to lead our Opportunity and Mobility Studies program after serving for more than 20 years in leadership positions in the social service programs of New York State and New York City.
And he's got a great podcast here at AEI called One-on-One with Robert Doar, which you and I have both been on. And now he's on our podcast. Here's our interview. Robert, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. I've been long waiting for this.
Well, we've been long waiting to have you on, and we finally got you, and it's great. So what we want to talk to you about is we're preparing for the inauguration of Donald J. Trump, the first president to lose the White House and then win it back 4 years later since Grover Cleveland in 1892. So it's a historic moment, but it's a challenging moment for people in the think tank world. How do you envision the role of a think tank like AEI in the Trump era?
Well, I don't actually find it that challenging. We have great scholars who do great work. We don't always agree with each other, and we don't always agree with President Trump and his people. But we are doing high quality stuff that we aspire to have impact, and we are independent. And because we're independent, that gives us credibility. Our quality gives us credibility, and our independence gives us credibility. And I've been very pleased by the reception of people in the Trump administration, people who are part of the transition, people around the president, to our work. They need help. They want help in tackling these tough challenges that we have as a country. And on many of those challenges, our scholars' viewpoint, broad perspective, less regulation, lower taxes, greater respect for free enterprise, are very much in alignment with what President Trump and his people want to do. And on some other things, we have some concerns. But I think it helps them when we both write things that are generally supportive and when we write things that are calling to attention things that may not work out so well or as well as they think they're going to. And so I feel very good. 6 months ago, I was a little worried that we might have a hard time with a new Trump administration if we weren't sufficiently on the team. But I couldn't do that to our scholars. I couldn't ask our people to toe the line or join the team or be more loyal to the Republican Party candidate. They wouldn't have liked it. They wouldn't have done it. But there's been no payback, no sense of a lack of our ability to get our ideas to be considered and to be advanced.
So, Robert, what you say is really interesting. Obviously, we have really good relations with some of the folks who are going into the Trump administration, and he's made some great picks. I mean, Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, in our national security space for Mark and for me and for Corey, our director, the relationships there are terrific. But I want to ask you a sort of a twofold question. Probably somewhere in the ballpark of 10, maybe a little more years ago, the Center for American Progress opened up a blog, which it called Think Progress, and a 501c4, which was the American Progress Action Fund. And for our listeners who don't understand, we're a C3. The Center for American Progress is a C3. That means we're a not-for-profit. We do not engage in specific political activities. C4s are basically like a PAC. They're basically engaged. And so they opened that up. And the organization itself became explicitly political as a result and very hyper-personal through its blog. The Heritage Foundation followed with its own Heritage Foundation Action Fund. And AEI has really stayed away from that profound politicization, swinging back and forth and back, depending on who's in the White House. Why do you think that we do not do that?
Because once you become part of a political operation, which, by the way, I've been part of, you have some commitment to loyalty where you have to sort of pull your punches and not call them straight. And I get that. But once you join that, you're not a think tank. You're not an independent entity evaluating issues clearly and openly and independently. You are part of the team. And that will change what you write and what you say. And I think in both of those instances, those institutions lost credibility. They became sort of hired hands of the DNC in one case and hired hands of the Republican Party or the Trump campaign. And then they're not independent. They're not credible. They're just another activist political group who has to bend their positions to comply with the talking points of the candidate on that day. And that's just not who we are. And I think that we've strengthened ourselves by avoiding that.
Even before the establishment of the C4 and sort of the Trumpification at Heritage, they always had a model of having a institutional position, which everyone in the institution had the total line. The Heritage position on Ukraine is this. The Heritage position on trade is this. And we don't have that at AEI. We're sort of a conservative university without students, but we have diversity of thought and we disagree amongst ourselves a lot. Why have we maintained that as an institutional model? And why do you think that's a better model for a think tank?
Well, just in Heritage's defense, there are lots of organizations on the left that also take an institutional position and hire their staffers to be the expert from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities or the expert from their organization who's advocating their institutional position. And those people are not established figures in their fields who've achieved a level of recognition and a level of prestige and support that comes from their work. And therefore, in my judgment, they're not as effective with members of Congress or with important people in the executive branch or in governor's office because they're not established, and know this is a controversial word these days, but they're not established experts in their field. They're not leaders in their field. Where the people that we hire are, they've reached a certain maturity before they come here, and they can speak with the credibility and the depth that comes with that experience. So, we don't take institutional positions because it allows our scholars to speak for themselves. And in speaking for themselves and their reputation and their records, in my judgment, their statements come with greater weight and influence. And then finally, I should say, I don't know about you, Mark, but people that work at AEI who have that independence and that freedom like it. It's a nice place to work. It makes you feel as if, your opinion matters. And you're free to say and think what you think. And that's the kind of place I want to be part of. And so it's working for us. It does make us occasionally incoherent. Sometimes, where's AEI coming from? And I have to explain that, AEI is a community of scholars. We have a broad perspective. I do want to be clear. We are right of center. We're unapologetically supporters of free markets and free people and limited government, things that would be called sort of traditional conservative views. But in that, there's a lot of diversity. And in that diversity, we get a lot of energy and a lot of, I think, credible participation in the public debate.
Just as an example of that, we had a few months ago, I went down into Mar-a-Lago and interviewed President Trump and talked to him about his views on legal immigration. And he expressed strong support for legal immigration. I published that article, and Mike Strain, our head of economic policy, reached out to me and said, would you mind if I wrote a rebuttal in National Review? And I said, mind, I'd love it. That would be great. And so he wrote a rebuttal, and then Ramesh Ponnuru wrote a rebuttal to Mike and published it. And then we all came on this podcast and hashed it out. And I thought that was like the best example of the intellectual vigor of AEI. It's like within our own institution, we were having a really interesting debate about something that's going to be a really important issue coming up in this new administration. I can't imagine another institution in Washington where that would have happened in the same way.
Because they've all retreated to their tribe, and we don't do that. We have broad beliefs. We are united in some core principles, but there's so much variety in how you approach these tough issues. And it's in that competition of ideas that I think you get to better solutions.
I think that's exactly right. But, we talked a little bit about this question of experts, and especially since COVID, but even beforehand, I would say even with the Iraq War, something which I'm a big supporter of, and as are some of our colleagues, the expert class is in particularly bad odor. And in many cases, this was very much an earned bad odor in the sense that there seemed to have been a conspiracy among senior officials in the Biden administration and in various communications spaces, online, on Twitter, and elsewhere, to suppress honest debate, something that Mark and I did very much during the COVID pandemic when we had a couple of people who are now going to be senior officials in the Trump administration talking about their doubts about the efficacy of certain measures, for example, school closure and things like that. But the reality is we are a bunch of experts. That's our business, right? We are experts in our various spaces. How do you feel that it is smartest to navigate the growing hostility to what we can sort of generally call the expert class?
Well, I think with the humility. I think the lack of respect for experts is in some respects justified. And I think we need to acknowledge that even we don't get it right all the time and haven't. I think in the particular debate in the conservative movement, I've said this before, there are 4 areas where the rise of the President Trump and the national conservatives has shown things that we need to be listening to. One of them is immigration. I believe that more immigration is good, but it should be legal. And I think we lost sight, or some people lost sight, that illegal immigration was causing a real problem. I also happen to think low-skilled immigration has costs associated with our welfare system that some conservative experts ignored, because the net benefit of immigration overall is economically positive, but it misses that there are some drawbacks and costs. Similarly on trade, I was with a scholar at AEI the other night, and he pointed out that a lot of experts, including some experts at AEI, were enthusiastic about welcoming China into the World Trade Organization and taking advantage of that huge market and that huge business opportunity. Well, those experts may have missed something, and I think we need to face up to that. And I think that AEI has adjusted to that, on both of these issues. The third is on entitlements. This is a little harder for me because I do believe that we have some real problems in our entitlement spending that we need to adjust to. But, a lot of middle-class Americans feel they paid into it, and they are really worried about people with budget-cutting acts hurting their retirement benefits. And then finally, and now we come to the sensitive one, perhaps, now that I'm talking to two foreign and defense policy scholars with a long history at AEI, the war in Iraq I supported too, but it didn't go quite as well as we had hoped it would. And a lot of Americans, including very prominent people in the incoming Trump administration, think it went very badly. And I think we need to acknowledge how hard it is to use American force in a big way with soldiers in places far away from the United States. I don't think that the lesson of Iraq is that we should have a retreat policy in Ukraine. But there are lessons from the 9/11 wars that are worth paying attention to.
How do we do that as an institution? Like right now, I'm not a huge fan of Robert F. Kennedy and sort of his vaccine doubting and some of his cockamamie theories, though I am sympathetic to the argument that our food supply has been tainted with a lot of bad stuff in it and that it's worth taking a look at some of that thing. So not everything he's saying is crazy, but when you say RFK is a bit of a crackpot on some of these issues, people look at, especially when our public health experts, including from our own institution, sort of criticize him, they look at the public health establishment and say, you're the people who told us that our kids had to stay out of school. You're the people who told us that we had to wear masks everywhere. You're the people who told us that 6 feet distancing when there was we now know that there's, and there was never any kind of accounting by the public health establishment for its failures in those things. How do we get back to that? How do we exercise that humility you talk about?
Well, first of all, it's very hard to do as an institution because
Yes.
we don't take institutional positions.
Yes.
One of the things that I've noticed is that there are some people in the world who can never admit they were wrong. You guys may know this now that you've gotten to know me better. That is not me. I'm very comfortable doing that. And I do think it helps you reestablish credibility. And so if you ask me, how do I think that happens? And I agree with you that in the public health area, and let's be clear, we were part of that too. We had a very prominent scholar, Scott Gottlieb. He was a Trump administration official. He's one of our most quoted and read scholars. I think he did pretty well. I'm pretty proud of him.
Yeah.
I stand by Scott 100%. But to the public, Scott was part of that establishment to some large extent. And I can't say that I've read every word that he's written, but I think that he has done and would do an assessment of where they made mistakes. And I think he would say that where they made mistakes, it was because they didn't know. They were operating without sufficient knowledge. And they were public health experts saying, not knowing, here are your risks, somebody may die. And politicians, to some extent, deferred to them and sort of turned over the responsibility of making the hard call and sort of hid behind them.
Yes.
And this risk of the really bad outcome. And that, I think, was also problematic. A lot of people didn't get COVID right in a lot of ways. And I don't think there's been a full accounting. I hope there will be.
Yeah, a full accounting would be nice. I really appreciate the word that you use, Robert, here, which is humility. It's absolutely correct to suggest that people of goodwill get things wrong. Right?
Yes,
You know,
exactly.
and,
It's
and,
hard.
and by the way, being wrong is not a sign of malignity, and it's not a sign that people are wrong on everything. So I'd love for our listeners to hear something that I particularly like about AEI, and I think that they'll appreciate this. One of the guys who we have had repeatedly on the podcast, someone who, for me, just nailed the election and the problems that the Democratic Party has, is a guy named Rui Teixeira. Now, to call Rui a Democrat is an understatement. This is a guy who, with John Judas in the early 2000s, wrote The Coming Democratic Majority. But he's an old school Democrat. Right? He's not he's not woke. He doesn't believe in intersectionality. He's not a huge
He's
lover
a liberal,
of critical.
not a progressive.
Well, he's actually, I think, a socialist, if you want to know the truth about it. But
Yeah.
on his economics is not great, but his judgment on
I totally agree with you. On economics, yes. I wish that we could have dissected him and left the economics part somewhere else. But you hired him, and I think that we've been really happy with that hire. Walk us through your thinking about bringing on board somebody like that to AEI.
Well, so, I don't do these things alone. I had observed his writing, but I didn't know him well. Yuval Levin did. Yuval was setting up a new center that was focusing on public opinion. He had been writing things about the extent to which working class Americans, including and especially minority working class Americans, were uncomfortable with the progressive leadership of the Democratic Party. And they were things like, if you ask Hispanic Americans, is the United States the greatest country in the world? 75% of them say yes, but only 25% of self-identified progressive Democrats say yes. And progressive Democrats run that party. So why would Hispanics want to be a part of a party that's run by people that don't see their country the way they see it? I was impressed by that. I think to some extent he was made to feel unwelcome at the think tank he was at. And he needed a place to hang his hat and have a desk and do his work. And he's really smart. He's a great colleague. He's blunt. He's a pretty good debater. He'll go back and forth with you in a fun way. He writes a lot. He writes well. And I said, this is a guy that really could add to our conversation in a positive way. And we don't ask him to analyze tax policy, and that's fine. He doesn't really want to analyze tax policy. But on the mood and views and cultural values of working class Americans, he's the best expert in the country.
And he's also he also is someone who embodies that humility, because of course he wrote that book with John Judas and they were wrong.
Yeah.
And he's been very vocal about the fact that they were wrong and trying to learn the lesson of why they were wrong and how the Democrats can fix their miscalculation that they shared. We could use a little bit more of that on the right, couldn't we?
Yeah, I think we could too, although I'm not sure what you're referring to. But I do want to say it is kind of odd sometimes that we have a scholar here who's always giving advice to the Democrats, which they don't take. But we're trying to help them out. We want them to be their best version of themselves. But I don't know what you mean on the right, Mark. I'm not sure what you're saying.
You
What's
talked
troubling
a little bit about it. I mean, you talk like trade policy, for example.
Yeah.
So, I remember once listening to an AEI colleague or reading something an AEI colleague said, or talking in favor of the TPP. And they said, well, there's no net job loss from the TPP. Well, there's a net job loss in Lordstown, Ohio. And there was a lot of net job loss in the lower end of the economy. There would have been a lot of job gain on the upper end of the economy. And I think one thing that we found was that that we're a democracy, and a lot of Americans were seeing that free trade, while it was generally beneficial to the country, was not beneficial to them, and they exercised their voice to speak up. And in a democracy, you have to be responsive not just to free trade principles and ideology, but also to the needs of your citizens. And if there's a lot of people saying, we slow it down, we need to soften the edges of this, then we need to be responsive to that.
Yeah, but I think, Mark, we've got scholars here, including the two of you, who have recognized that an insufficient attention to China as an adversary has led to these trade problems, in part, that have caused difficulties for our people because they were behaving unfairly, and they could take advantage of certain benefits that they have with regard to their economy that And I think we've recognized that. We've also recognized them as an adversary in the world and an adversary with regard to Taiwan. And I think there has been some of that among scholars here. Now I will tell you where I am worried about some arrogance or lack of humility. And this happens, Mark, you got to agree, every time you win a big election, is you overread your mandate and you decide, see, we're right. The national conservative approach to our economy with heavy industrial policy, work rules patterned after Germany, family benefit policy patterned after Europe, that means those things are what Americans want. And we know we're right. And I don't think that's right either. I think that would be an overreach, and it would be the Europeanization of America. We don't want that. Our economy is growing faster and raising standards of living and incomes and wages faster than anything in Europe. Why would we want to have a national industrial economic policy that was more like them? I can't think of a worse idea. And I think we at AEI, our scholars, are going to need to fight that out a little bit with the Trump administration in the coming years.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that there's lots and lots of room for debate. But I think that the issue that you two just discussed is one that's important. So, for example, let me use this expression loosely. People like us have argued historically that free trade is a rising tide that lifts all boats. And the reality is, while I continue to believe, and I think most of our economists continue to believe, that free trade is a net positive, the issue when you say net positive is, in fact, that there are losers in that game.
Not all boats. It doesn't
Right.
lift all boats. Some boats sink.
Exactly. And where I think Donald Trump really understood something was that there is deeply, deeply held resentment among certain Americans who don't deserve to be sneered at about the fact that they weren't in the great boat, right? They were in the Titanic. And
Yeah, I get that, Danny. But, remember, I come from the conservative welfare policy where
Right.
we also said that people may have suffered some difficulties, but in order to help them move up, they need to make some effort to help themselves move up. And there has to be a work expectation and a work requirement. We have to talk about the benefits of two engaged parents in families' lives. We were very clear that we were bringing a sense of personal responsibility to the safety net programs that was absent before. I sometimes hear a failure among these new Republicans to hold the people they care about, the ones you're referring to the same standard of personal responsibility. That they basically say all of the problems that they've suffered, none of them have anything to do with choices they've made. And I'm sorry, I've been around in America enough to know that that's not entirely true.
I agree with you.
right,
100%.
I couldn't agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, look, I mean, personal agency is a huge issue. If you're sitting in your basement if you're sitting in your mom's basement and gaming and popping, mushrooms, you're not taking personal responsibility. And there's no question. And that is how you end up becoming Europe. Believe you me, I see this all over Europe is young people who not only don't believe in the need to work, they don't even understand what real work is. And this Gen Z sense of entitlement is going to come back and bite us in the butt.
If we're not careful.
Especially if we look at Nick Eberstadt's work, which suggests to us that there aren't going to be as many young people in the future as there have been in the past to hold up the likes of you and me and Mark. How does a place like AEI answer that? So, for example, you're totally right. Entitlement reform, it needs to be a real thing. The Trump administration didn't want it any more than the Biden administration wants it. What's our answer to that?
Well, I think we have to put the material and the evidence out on how it will be helpful to our country. We have to make the argument. We have to have a communications team that makes sure that your work or your colleagues in the economics field's work is seen and read as broadly as possible. We also have to develop relationships with the leaders in Congress. I was over in the Senate yesterday, saw a couple senators, and they were strategically identified as people that I think are going to be willing to question or challenge what I think are overreach that might come from the Trump administration's fascination with industrial policy. And we want them to know that there are others who are thinking like them and want to help them with evidence and facts. And strategizing on how to advance public policy that is better than would be without their efforts. And you guys have been around this town longer than I have, but we've been together in public policy a long time. We actually believe we wouldn't do this work if we didn't think that it has an impact, that you call enough people, you talk about it, you write a column. Mark, you've seen this in the last year with your columns about the benefits to American manufacturers of the aid to the Ukraine bill. People, congressmen hear that, they learn that, they change their vote or they join a vote, and the legislation gets improved. So I think that's what we do, and I think there's so many opportunities with the new administration and the new Congress to make some real positive change. And there are a few things I'm worried about, but if I work hard at it, I think at the end of the day, they'll come out okay. But that's why I get up every day and do this job. And it does happen. The thing I hope we're telling your listeners that it really, we don't be so cynical about politics and public policy in America, because good things do happen. The Ukraine aid bill passed. The Build Back Better legislation was modified so it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Other things happen every year.
So this gets back to our discussion a little bit about experts. One of the problems with experts is that they're sort of stovepiped in their field of expertise, right? And public policy isn't just economic policy. It's not just trade policy. You know, one of the problems with COVID is we put virologists in charge of the economy.
Yeah.
You know, and so we were taking their advice, which much of which turned out to be wrong, but their advice on how to handle a virus, and didn't factor in the advice of economists saying, well, this is going to unleash historic inflation and all the rest of it. And that one of the lessons is you don't just put the virologists in charge of the country. You have to balance. The president's job is to balance their advice against the advice of the economists and make decisions, right? It's the same thing with trade, where, you know, we believe in free trade, but we put a free trade economists in charge of national security policy, and we ended up letting China get control of things that are absolutely vital to our national security. Like, you know, we had a great event at AEI with the chairman and ranking member of the China Select Committee, where they were talking about how all the cranes in our shipping ports are controlled by Beijing, by remote control, and we don't make cranes anymore. I mean, you know, how do we avoid the stovepiping as an institution? How do we bring the expertise of all of our different people together and sort of bring it together in a way that is helpful for public policy experts as opposed to narrowly in our stovepipes?
Well, here's one where, you know, I don't, know that you guys will completely agree, but I think you give the scholars as much freedom as possible. We've got a lot of smart people. And I do think that sometimes a perspective from someone outside the field can be helpful in critiquing the groupthink of the experts in a field. And so I have allowed that and encouraged that. I'm not one to say that economists can only write about the economy and the foreign and defense people can only write about foreign and defense. So I think you allow for the greatest amount of freedom for smart people to get in there. And sometimes somebody will write something and it won't make sense or won't be actually correct, and people will be upset. But I'd rather make a mistake in allowing that kind of open dialogue and participation than make the mistake that comes when you just restrict people from participating in the debate and discussion. When you brought up the issue of lanes and stovepipes, when we're done, I'm about to go talk to a scholar who's concerned about somebody who's writing about a field that's close to his, but he's not in his department. And I got to calm him down and say, it's okay. Don't let it upset you. Go write your own thing, but don't be shutting down debate. I don't think that helps.
No, I agree with you. I think that people do get frustrated when we see people in spaces where they have no expertise. But, there's a marketplace in ideas, and we got to be willing to compete. If somebody gets far by making an argument that we don't agree with, then the right call is to disagree with them in another place rather than to say that they're not allowed to speak. So exit question for me, Robert. Yeah, as you look ahead, and we've got the inauguration of a new president. We apparently have no president right now, so which has been a very weird period of time for us. But as you look forward to the inauguration of the next president, when you think about your priorities, like what do you really want to see out of AEI? When I was in management, I used to ask interviewees that great question from the Blues Brothers, which obviously informs so much of my intellectual work, which is, what is your mission from God? What's the mission from God? What's the thing that you really are looking to see from the coming year from us?
Well, I want you to know, we put our finger on the scale of the work of the scholars that are on the issues that we think are most pressing and most significant for our country. And right now, I think that the conflict in Ukraine is really important. And I want us to find a solution there that doesn't allow, or I want our country to find a solution there that doesn't allow Russia to win and that preserves an independent state in Ukraine and the possibility of an independent state for all of Ukraine eventually. So we'll put some effort on our scholars that are working on that. I'm more concerned than I have been in the past about the cost of government and the debt and the deficit, and I think that we need to be watching this tax bill carefully to make sure that it doesn't make a problem that is bad worse. So I'll be looking to find ways to do that. That's what I talked to one of the senators about yesterday. Our economy is in very good shape, and the key ingredient is to extend the tax cuts that were done and to preserve that pro-growth position that we're in. I don't know that we have to do a lot more to stimulate the economy because I'm not sure that we can afford it. So that's a big one. I'm really focused on the universities. I think, thankfully, they're making progress. I really do. I think that they know they're in retreat. They know that they had lost their way in providing a truly liberal education with viewpoint diversity and a respect for free speech. They are embarrassed by this rise of anti-Semitism among their students, and they are looking to us at AEI to help them get back to where they should be. Don't get me right, I'm not satisfied, and we got to keep the pressure on them. But I want us to be very active in that discussion. I think universities are close to us. We're a research institution. We care about them, and we want them to be. So those are three big priorities. I get pretty specific. You can be, I could say I'm all for preserving free markets and, preserving our democracy. But what does that mean? I want specific outcomes on specific policy debates. And those are three that I'm concerned about.
My exit question is about the Doge. So, what do you think of the Doge? And I think it seems like a natural place where AEI could really have a big role because this is it's not really a Department of Government Efficiency because it's not actually a government agency. It's going to be an outside advisory group, which is what we are in some ways. And, obviously it is going to be of limited utility in handling the debt in the sense that, Social Security and Medicare are the drivers of our debt, but we owe the American people to use every penny of
I
our
agree.
tax
I'm
dollars.
excited by it. I'm closer to Elon Musk in the leadership team than I am to the other fellow. But I think that was one of the developments, and this came up yesterday with the member in Congress. Previous to the emergence of Doge and this commitment to reduce federal spending, Donald Trump never talked about that. It was not a high priority. He never talked about it. Now he is, and I think that's a step in the right direction. I worked in government, headcount restrictions, holding down the rise of the federal workforce. That's a good thing. There's money to be saved there. And I want the federal agencies to feel pressure about efficiency and effectiveness and costs. And I think that it's not going to solve the debt and deficit problem, but it's going to be helpful, and it's going to make Americans feel like their government is being run in a way that is consistent with their values. And so I'm very excited about it. I think it's one of the better things that has happened in the Trump campaign world as the campaign came to an end. And and absolutely right, we're sending over ideas. We've got lots of ideas on how you can reduce the cost of federal government. I had a nice exchange with Mr. Oz, who's going to CMS. There's a lot of potential savings at CMS. Medicaid and Medicare have never really been run by people that want to control spending, and I think there's potential there.
Well, as an expert on welfare reform, having work requirements for federal employees would be a good place to
Yeah,
start.
well, that's exactly right. How about
Right?
getting them to go to work? Exactly. Yes.
Oh, I think the numbers are staggering. And, just one tiny anecdote before we say goodbye. But, Robert, I've sort of adopted these two Afghan girls who came to America without their parents. At a certain point, they had gotten a phone call from someone in the government, and they ended up not understanding and garbling the numbers. So I picked up the phone to try to call somebody at the State Department. I went through the phone list of the State Department Bureau of Consular Affairs, which is a pretty big and important bureau. Not one phone number answered, right? No voicemail.
I know. My wife has similar stories about her interactions with anybody having to do with. Sarah runs the human resources department of a small food service company, and it's terrible. And so I love that. Let's put some pressure on government to be run more efficiently.
Oh, God. Amen to that. If we only
There
accomplish
you go.
one
That was
really
pretty
big
easy.
thing,
That's pretty easy.
that would be great.
Yes.
Go Doge.
Yes.
Anyway, Robert, thank you. Thank you for employing us. Thank you
You
for
guys have been
joining
very
us.
helpful to me. It's a community effort at AEI. Your listeners should know that both of you have been really helpful and supportive to me since I've been in this job. And you were experienced, old hands, and I needed that help and support, and I really appreciate it.
Well, we're grateful for your support and your leadership of this institution.
Well, we loved having you, and we love being at AEI. So thanks.
So, Danny, what'd you think?
So one of the things I like about podcasts like this is it gives me an opportunity to think about our space and our influence because you need to work at it. You need to actually build relationships. One of the things, though, that I think is really, really true, and I've seen this from the Trump administration, incoming Trump administration, is they're not looking for people who pander to them. They really aren't. I think one of the things that is least attractive is sycophancy. And one of the things that I've seen is that while the Biden administration and especially the Obama administration were intolerant of any dissent whatsoever, right? You said one thing against them and the head of the Center for American Progress would get a nasty phone call from the White House chief of staff. One of the things I've really appreciated about Trump in his first term, and I appreciate about the incoming team, is that's not what they're like at all. They've been open to ideas. They've been interested in ideas, and, they want to be revolutionaries. And I think that kind of thinking outside the box will be very refreshing to us in Washington.
I agree with you. And one of the things I like about the first Trump administration, and I like about many of his picks in this administration, is it's a team of rival, in the phrase referring to Lincoln's cabinet, in the sense that they're people who have differing views on different public policy issues that are going to debate them out. And he's going to get advice from lots and lots of different points of view. And I think that's good. I think that's good for him, and I think it's good for the country. So I'm bullish on what could happen. I think you've got an administration. There are areas where I disagree with sort of where their emphasis is. There are people in the cabinet choices that I have. There are some that I am really enthusiastic about, and some that I'm less enthusiastic about, and one or two that I'm really not enthusiastic about. One of whom is no longer a cabinet nominee. But I'm bullish on what can happen. I think his first term was in many ways a hugely successful term. And I think the difference now is that he has a mandate. He won the popular vote. He overcame all the different attempts to destroy him. He's got a chance to do something truly revolutionary in a lot of areas, and I want to see what he does. I think I'm going to have the same approach to the second Trump term that I did with the first, which was to support him when he does the right thing, to defend him when he's unjustly attacked, and to constructively criticize him when I think he's going in the wrong direction. And my goal, I want Trump to be a success. And I think whether you voted for him or not, we should all want Trump to be a success. And I think AEI's got a really important role to play in helping him be a success.
Well, I agree. I wanted Joe Biden to be a success too. I mean, at the end of the day, we want our,
we tried.
we're Americans before we're partisans, and I wish Joe Biden had been a success.
My first piece before Joe Biden took the oath of office is Joe Biden is my president. Because I remember when when Trump was elected, the cry went up, he is not my president. And it's like, sorry, no, he is your president. And I wanted Joe Biden to succeed. I had low level of confidence that he would, and my worst expectations were exceeded. But I wanted him to be successful, and I think everybody should want Donald Trump to be successful.
No,
and try
I
to help
agree.
him.
I agree. Call balls and strikes, do the right thing. But, when America prospers, the world is a better place. And for America to prosper, you need good leadership. That's one thing we've learned for sure over the last couple of years. Hey, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this podcast. Let us know what you think. Read our Substack. Don't forget to message us if you have concerns or ideas. And thanks for being with us.
Take care. See you next week. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.